The rise and fall of Australia's banana capital, Coffs Harbour. Every Australian knows the big banana. Almost nobody remembers why it is there. Beside the highway on the north coast of New South Wales stands a giant banana of concrete and steel, 13 metres of painted yellow that has pulled 10 million people off the road since it was raised. And it was raised in 1964 for one plain reason: to prove that this town was the banana capital of the country. For half a century, Coffs Harbour was bananas. The steep green hillsides above the sea were striped from top to bottom with plantations. Hundreds of families made their living off the fruit, and the whole town wrapped its identity so tightly around a single crop that it built a monument to it beside the road. Then the crop went away. Up in the flat, tropical north of Queensland, bigger farms on easier ground grew the same fruit faster and cheaper than the hand-worked hillsides of Coffs ever could, and one by one the plantations stopped paying. The steep slopes that had grown bananas for a lifetime were sold off for houses with ocean views, or replanted with a different crop entirely, and the town went on growing even as the thing it was famous for quietly disappeared from the hills around it. Today, the big banana is a fun park with water slides, the hills grow blueberries and rooftops, and the most famous roadside monument in the country stands as something nobody ever meant it to be: a memorial in concrete to an industry that packed up and left. This is the story of Coffs Harbour, the capital that outlived its crown. Chapter 1. The Sharing People. Before the crop, before the town, before the name that any map would carry, there was the coast. On the mid-north coast of New South Wales, roughly midway between Sydney and Brisbane, around 500 kilometres north of the older city, the land does not ease down to the sea the way a coastline is expected to. It rises. The ranges push almost to the water, and the hills stand up behind a thin edge of shore, green and steep and wet, so that the country reads from a passing ship as a wall of forest with the surf at its foot. Rain falls on it heavily and often. Creeks run straight off the slopes and reach the sea within a few miles of their start. It is a narrow, folded, dripping country, held between the mountains and the water, and it was old and worked and thoroughly understood long before anyone thought to plant a banana on it. This is the country of the Gumbaynggirr people. Their country runs along this stretch of coast and back into the ranges, from the rivers in the south to the headlands in the north, and inland to the high spine of the Great Dividing Range, and they have held it by their own account and by every reckoning that reaches back far enough for thousands of years. They are known, in their own telling, as the Sharing People, a name earned in the ordinary business of living well in a rich place, and it was a rich place. The sea lay on one side and the forest on the other. The creeks came down full off the hills, and a people who knew the country could take from all three across the turning of the year. Nothing here was empty. Every headland and creek and reach of forest had a name and a use and a place in a knowledge older than any written record of the coast. It is worth being plain about that, because the story that follows is a story of newcomers, and the newcomers would tell it as a story of arrival, of a harbour found, a town founded, a wilderness turned to use. It was not a wilderness. The land the timber getters would cut and the farmers would clear, and the growers would stripe with green was not discovered by any of them. It was taken up over the top of a country already lived in, already named, already carrying thousands of years of the people who belonged to it. The Gumbaynggirr did not vanish when the ships came. Their connection to this coast did not end with the jetty or the plantations or the highway, and it has not ended now. Whatever else was built on these hills, it was built on Gumbaynggirr country, and it is Gumbaynggirr country still. The steepness that would one day decide everything, that would make the place famous and then undo it, was here before any of that. The hills that grew the bananas, and that were in the end too steep to grow them cheaply, were standing over the water long before the first log was floated down a creek. The wet green slopes tumbling to a narrow shore, the ranges at their back, the rain coming in off the sea. This was the shape of the country the Sharing People had lived in for longer than the newcomers could easily imagine. Everything that came after, the red gold, the fruit, the concrete monument by the road, would be laid one thin layer at a time over a coast that was already whole. It began, as it would end, as a line of steep green hills standing quietly above the sea. Chapter 2. Red Gold and the Jetty. The first thing the newcomers wanted from this coast was not the soil, but the trees. In the middle of the 19th century, the timber getters came for the red cedar that grew through the coastal forests. Red gold, they called it, for the price a good log could fetch, and the speed with which the men who cut it went broke, chasing more. Cedar was the making of half the river towns of the north coast, and it was taken here as it was taken everywhere the tree grew, fast and without much thought for what came after. The getters worked the cedar out of the hills and floated the logs down the creeks to the shelter of the coast, where small ships could stand in behind the headland and take the timber off. At the mouth of one such creek, Coffs Creek, running down to a stretch of water partly sheltered by Muttonbird Island, a landing grew into a settlement, and the settlement grew around the one thing it had to offer the world, which was whatever it could load onto a ship. For a place like that, everything turned on the loading. A coast with no deep harbour and a heavy surf is a hard place to get cargo off the land and onto the water, and for years the work was done the slow way, by boat and by hand, out through the swell to vessels standing off. What changed the settlement into a port was a single piece of engineering. In 1892, the town built a jetty, some 500 metres of timber running straight out into the sea, with a steam crane at its head and a rail line laid along its deck, so that a wagon could be run out over the water and its load swung down into a ship's hold without ever touching a small boat. It was built first for the cedar, but the cedar was already thinning, a forest cut that hard does not last. And as the great trees gave out, the jetty turned to carrying whatever the district could grow in the cleared ground the timber had left behind. That ground was the point. Behind the beach, the hills stood steep and wet and fertile, and as the cedar went, the settlers who stayed began to farm the slopes the getters had opened. What the hills produced had to leave by sea, and for a long generation the jetty was the only road to the wider world worth the name. The rail along its deck fed a line that reached back into the town, and in time, into the country beyond it. The North Coast Railway arrived in the 1910s, giving the place a landward connection it had never had, and the through line south, joining the town by rail to Sydney, was finished in the course of the 1920s. From that point, the district had two ways out, the ships from the jetty and the trains down the coast, and both of them existed to carry away what the hills could grow. So the town was, from its first day as a port, a place defined entirely by what it could send somewhere else. It did not consume what it produced, it shipped it. Cedar first, then a scattering of farm produce, and soon, climbing the steep, wet slopes that the timber getters had unroofed, the crop that would give the place its name and its fame, and in the end its long decline. But that was still to come. For now there was only the jetty, 500 metres of tarred timber, standing out into the swell behind Muttonbird Island, the steam crane turning at its head, the rails running out over the water, a port waiting, without yet knowing it, for the fruit that was about to take the hills. Chapter 3. Bananas take the hills. Bananas suited these hills as almost nothing else could. The banana is a plant of warm, wet, well-drained ground, and a steep slope on a high rainfall coast is exactly that. The water runs off it rather than sitting. The frost seldom reaches it, and the sun finds every row. What was awkward for almost any other kind of farming, the sheer pitch of the country, was for bananas an advantage. From the late 1800s and into the early years of the new century, the fruit began to go in up the slopes above the coast, planted by hand on ground too steep for a plough, and it took to the hills of the north coast as though the two had been made for each other. It was planted in many cases by people who had come a very long way to plant it. The banana country of northern New South Wales was built by migrants as much as by anyone born to it. Italian families took up land across the district and across the northern rivers beyond it, and made a large part of the regions growing their own. And from the 1940s, Punjabi Sikh families settled on the hills around Woolgoolga, a little to the north of Coffs, in numbers that would make the place remarkable. They came first as labour brought in to cut and carry and tend during the wartime shortage of hands. And then, working the ground season after season, they took leases and in time bought farms of their own, until the community around Woolgoolga had become one of the oldest and largest rural Indian communities in the country. They did it for the first decades, as people not yet granted the full rights of the citizens beside them, farming the land in earnest for years before the law caught up, and the reforms of the 1970s made them in full what they had long since become in fact. The banana hills were their making. And they would still be there for the crop that came after. They were not the first to grow the fruit commercially in the colony. That distinction belonged further north, up toward the Tweed and the border rivers, where Chinese growers had pioneered the commercial banana trade decades before, working the ground on the far side of the region entirely. The Coffs Hills were a later chapter of a story that had begun somewhere else. But chance, when it came down firmly on the side of Coffs, and it came in the form of disease. In the late 1920s, a wave of banana sickness moved through the plantations of the north, the kind of blight that can empty a hillside in a season and leave the ground unfit to replant. It fell hardest on the older growing districts further up the coast, and as it thinned their crop, it lifted, by simple subtraction, the standing of the hills to the south. What the disease took from the north it handed to Coffs, and so the balance tipped. The growing that had been spread along the whole north coast began to gather on the steep green slopes above Coffs Harbour and the towns around it, where the blight had bitten less deep and the ground was still sound. The plantations climbed the hills in long vertical rows, worked entirely by hand because nothing else could hold to such a pitch, the men moving up and down the slopes with the bunches on their shoulders. Year by year there were more of them. The fruit that had once been one crop among many along the coast was becoming, on these particular hills, the whole business of the place. The green rows climbing from the valley floor to the ridgeline, striping every slope in sight, a landscape being remade one plantation at a time into the shape of a single crop. Chapter 4. The Banana Capital. For a long stretch of the 20th century, this one district on the New South Wales coast was, quite simply, where the country's bananas came from. New South Wales at its height grew something on the order of 95% of all the bananas in Australia, and the great majority of that came off these hillsides. The slopes above Coffs and the run of towns around it, striped top to bottom with the long green rows. It was a strange kind of dominance because it was won on the worst possible ground for it. The fruit grew on land so steep that every part of the work was done by hand. The planting, the tending, the cutting, the carrying of the bunches down, slopes a machine could not climb. What the district had instead of easy ground was rain and warmth, and an enormous quantity of human labour willing to go up and down the hills. And for half a century, that was enough to feed the nation. The scale of it, at the peak, was the scale of a whole society organised around a single fruit. Hundreds of family plantations covered the district, each one a slope or two of green worked by a household and its hired cutters. The number of growers climbed over the decades toward 1,000 at its height. Not the faceless thousands of a great industry, but 1,000 families near enough, each with its name on a hillside. Around them grew everything a crop on that scale requires. The packing sheds where the bunches were cut down into hands and boxed, the carriers who ran the cases down out of the hills, the agents who watched the market, the rail wagons, and the ships that took the fruit south to the cities, the jetty and the railway that the town had built to send away its timber, now sent away its fruit, case upon case of it, week after week, year upon year. And the fruit set the rhythm of everything. The working week in Coffs Harbour ran on the banana, on the cutting and the packing and the getting of the crop to market before it turned, and the household economy of the district ran on the price of a case, which every grower watched the way a sailor watches the sky. A good season lifted the whole town. A glut or a poor price was felt in every shop on the main street. Children grew up on the plantations and went into them. The knowledge of how to grow the fruit on ground that steep passed down the slopes from one generation to the next. It was not an industry the town happened to have. It was the town, The bananas were its work and its wage, its reason for the jetty and the railway, its place in the mind of the rest of the country, and its own idea of what it was. That completeness is the thing to hold on to, because it explains what came next. A place does not build a monument to something it merely does for a living. It builds a monument to something it believes it is. And Coffs, by the middle of the century, believed itself to be the banana capital of Australia. Not as a slogan, but as a plain description of the fact. 95% of the nation's crop coming off a coast whose whole visible surface was banana rows. A town that's certain of what it was would, before very long, feel the need to say so out loud in something that could be seen from the road. The hills stood striped from valley to ridge in every direction, the green rows climbing to the skyline, and somewhere among them the idea was already forming that a place this sure of itself ought to raise beside the highway a marker the size of the thing it lived on. Chapter 5. The Concrete Banana. The monument began with a fruit stall by the road. On the highway that ran through the town, an expatriate Californian named John Landy sold bananas to the passing traffic. He and his wife Betty, keeping the kind of roadside stand that 100 growing districts kept in those years, a shed of fruit set out to catch the cars going by. The trouble with a roadside stall is that the cars do not stop, and Landy wanted them to. He had seen, somewhere in his travels, a giant pineapple standing beside a road in Hawaii, built for exactly that purpose, to make a driver slow and turn in and buy. And he decided that what had worked for a pineapple in the Pacific could work for a banana on the coast of New South Wales. He would build something so large and so plainly what it was that no one driving past could pretend not to have seen it. The shape was the hard part. A banana is not a simple curve. It bends and tapers and turns along its length. And to raise one the size of a building meant working out in steel and concrete a form that nature had made and no builder had ever copied at that scale. That work fell to a local engineer named Alan Chapman, who solved it the way a practical man solves a problem he cannot simply calculate. He took a real banana and cut it into about 40 sections across its length, tracing each slice in turn, reading the true curve of the fruit off the thing itself, and scaling it up piece by piece into a frame. A builder named Alan Harvey raised the structure over that frame, a skin of concrete laid on steel and wire mesh, the work beginning in September 1964 and rising beside the highway through the last months of the year. And on the 22nd of December 1964, for a cost of about £1,200, the big banana opened. It stood about 13 metres long, a single vast arc of painted yellow over the road, and it was billed, without much fear of contradiction, as the biggest banana in the world. There had been nothing quite like it before. It is widely regarded as Australia's first purpose-built big thing, the first of a whole national habit of enormous roadside objects, the giant sheep and prawns and merinos and pineapples that would one day run into the thousands across the country. And the habit began here, on this stretch of coast, with a Californian who only wanted the cars to stop. And the cars stopped. It worked exactly as intended, and better. Drivers slowed and turned in and got out to stand beneath it, and the stall that had struggled to be noticed became a place people drove to on purpose. The banana built to sell bananas became, almost at once, the reason people came at all. Landy had reached for a way to move a little more fruit, and had given the town instead the image it would carry for the rest of the century, the one shape by which the whole country would come to know the place. For that was the deeper thing the monument did. Coffs Harbour was, in those years, as sure of itself as a town can be. It grew the nation's bananas on the hills above the sea, and had wrapped its whole idea of itself around the crop. Now it had, beside the road, a banana the size of a house to say so aloud. The capital had raised a monument to its crown, while the crown still sat firmly on its head. And there it stood at the edge of the highway as 1964 closed. A great yellow curve of concrete against the green hills behind, every one of them striped top to bottom with the living fruit it had been built to celebrate. Chapter 6. The Queensland Problem. The trouble, when it came, did not come from the town or the crop or the men who grew it. It came from the north, and it came from the shape of the land itself. Far up in tropical Queensland, around Tully and Innisfail, on the wet coast below the ranges, there was banana country too. And that country was flat. It is a plain word for a decisive thing. Flat land could be farmed in a way the steep hillsides of Coffs never could, and out of that single difference the whole balance of an industry would slowly turn. On the Queensland plains, the farms could be large, and the ground could take machines. A tractor could run the rows. The fruit could be moved on wheels rather than carried on a man's shoulder down a slope no vehicle could climb. The blocks were bigger, the work was mechanized, and every step that a machine took over from a pair of hands took a little more cost out of each case of fruit. The tropical north grew its bananas faster too, and larger. The warm, flat country bringing the bunches on quicker and heavier than the cooler southern hillsides ever brought them. Set against that, everything that had made Coffs distinctive turned quietly into a disadvantage. The steepness that gave the plantations their look, the handwork that had built a way of life, the closeness to the sea. In the plain arithmetic of growing bananas for a national market, all of it counted against the place. A Coffs banana matured more slowly on its cool southern slope. It ran shorter in the bunch, and grown in the damp air of the coast, it picked up more of the small marks that insects leave on the skin, so that even the look of the fruit told against it beside the clean, tropical product from the north. None of this was a matter of skill, and none of it could be answered by working harder. The grower on a Coffs hillside could cut and carry and tend his rows as well as any man alive, and it would not close the gap because the gap was not in the man. It was in the ground. He was farming a slope by hand. His competitor was farming a plain by machine, and no amount of care on the steep country could make its fruit as cheap as fruit grown flat. The cost of a case was being set in the tropical north, and the north could set it lower, and cost in the end was the whole game. Bananas are bananas. A shopper in Sydney or Melbourne buying a hand of fruit does not know or care which slope it grew on, only what it costs, and buys the cheaper without a second thought. In a market like that, the low-cost grower does not merely do well. He sets the price the high-cost grower must somehow meet, and the high-cost grower who cannot meet it does not lose an argument. He loses his living. Queensland was becoming that low-cost grower, and Coffs, on its beautiful hand-worked hills, was becoming the one who could not match the number. So the capital was undersold, not in a season or a slump, but structurally, in the bones of the thing by ground it could never turn into. There was no clever answer to it, and no villain in it, only geography doing its slow accounting. Year by year, a larger share of the nation's bananas came off the flat tropical north, and a smaller share off the slopes above Coffs, and the shift was as quiet and as steady as water finding the lower ground. On the hillsides, the long rows still hung green and heavy above the sea, as handsome as they had ever been, and worth with every passing season a little less against the plain. Chapter 7. The slow slip. It was not a collapse. That is the first thing to say about the end of the Coffs banana, because it is the thing most easily told wrong. There was no single year the industry fell, no disaster that took it in a season. There was only a slow slip, a long and grinding loss of ground, as the thing that had made the district rich stopped quietly and by degrees paying the people who worked it. What ground the plantations down was oversupply, and the low prices that come with it. As Queensland grew more and more of the nation's fruit on its cheap flatland, the market filled, and a full market is a market of falling prices. On good ground, a low price is a hard year. On a steep, hand-worked hillside, where every case costs more to grow in the first place, a low price is fatal. The Coffs grower watched the number he was paid drift down toward the number it cost him to grow, and then below it, until the arithmetic that had fed families for half a century simply stopped adding up. By around 2010, growers on the hills were saying plainly that they made money in barely a month of the year, that for 11 months out of 12, the fruit came off the slope at a loss, and only for a few weeks did the price rise enough to leave anything behind. Here it is worth being careful, because there are storms in this story that people half remember and set in the wrong place. 2 great cyclones fell on the banana country in these years, Larry in 2006 and Yasi in 2011. And they were genuinely destructive, tearing through the plantations and flattening the crop across whole districts. But they fell on Queensland, not on Coffs. They struck the flat tropical north where the nation's bananas by then were grown, and because so much of the country's fruit stood in their path, they wiped out most of the national crop at a stroke and sent the price of a banana soaring to something like $12 to $18 a kilo in the worst of the shortages. And a price like that, for the growers still standing on the hills of Coffs, was not a wound, but a windfall. With the north levelled, the southern fruit that survived sold for more than it had in years. So the cyclones, if anything, briefly helped the very growers people imagine they destroyed. They hammered Queensland. They did not kill Coffs. And when the northern plantations were replanted and came back into bearing, as after a season or two they always did, the price fell again. And the slow slip on the southern hillsides went on exactly as before, its long downward grade untouched by the storms that had never touched it. Disease pressed in too, here and there, as it always had along the coast, adding its own strain to hills that had little strength to spare. But the real killer has to be named plainly, because it was not the dramatic thing. It was not a storm, and it was not a plague. It was a crop that no longer paid, grown on slopes too steep to farm any cheaper, worked by hand because no machine could climb them, and undersold year after quiet year by flatter ground 1,000 kilometres to the north. The bananas of Coffs were not destroyed, they were simply beaten on cost slowly until it was no longer worth the cutting. And so, one hillside at a time, the cutting stopped. A grower would work a slope a season too long, and then not replant it. The rows would stand on unpicked, the bunches going over on the stem, until the green began to give way to weed and lantana, on a hillside that had fed a family for 2 generations. A plantation left to go quiet above the sea, waiting, though no one yet said it aloud, for someone to come and buy the view. Chapter 8. The hills become houses. When a crop stops paying, the ground it grew on does not lose its worth. It only finds another use for it. Through the 1980s and the years that followed, the steep green hillsides above Coffs Harbour began to be worth far more for what could be built on them than for anything that could be raised on them. And the reckoning that came out of that was as plain and as final as the cost arithmetic that had undone the fruit in the first place. A slope that lost money under bananas could be carved into blocks and sold for houses, and the houses carried something the bananas never had, a view of the sea. By now, Coffs Harbour was no longer only a farm town. It had become a coast. People came to live beside the water and to retire beside it, drawn by the warm sea and the green hills that had until then been prized only for what they could be made to grow. What the newcomers wanted was not the soil, but the outlook, and the outlook was best from exactly the ground the plantations held, high on the slopes, above the town, with the ocean laid out below. The very steepness that had made the hillsides so hard to farm, that had kept the work to hand and the fruit small, made them, for a house, close to perfect. And so the exchange began, one plantation at a time. A grower who had watched the price of a case of fruit fall year after year on ground too steep to farm any cheaper, was offered for his hillside a sum no season of bananas could ever match. The rational thing, the only thing, was to sell. The green rows came out, the surveyors came in and marked the slope into blocks, and the blocks filled with houses, brick and tile where the long lines of green had run, driveways switching back up the contours the pickers had once climbed by hand. It did not happen all at once, and it did not happen as a defeat. It happened quietly, plantation by plantation, as the older growers reached the end of their working lives and found that the most valuable thing they owned was no longer the crop, but the hill it stood on. The numbers of the town tell the size of it. In the middle of the 1960s, Coffs Harbour was a place of about 15,000 people. By the middle of the 1970s, it had passed 25,000. By the 1980s, 40,000 and more. And it went on climbing until, in our own time, it stands at close to 80,000, very nearly a 5-fold rise across a single lifetime. A town that had been built around a crop grew into a small city built around the coast itself, and a great deal of that growth spread upward, into the hills, onto the very slopes the bananas had held. The subdivisions ran up the contours the plantations had striped. Where the fruit came down, the houses went up, and they went up in their thousands. It is worth saying plainly what did and did not happen here, because it is easy to tell wrong. The bananas were not beaten off these hills by storm or blight or ruin. They were outbid for them. The land under them simply became worth more as something else, and in the face of that, farming it was a choice fewer and fewer people could afford to make. The crop did not fail on the hillsides of Coffs. It was priced off them, block by surveyed block, by the houses of the people the coast was drawing in, until, standing on a slope above the town, you could look down the fall of the land and see where the long green rows had once run unbroken to the ridgeline, the tiled roofs of a suburb catching the same sun the bananas had grown in. Chapter 9. The New Crop. Not all of the hills went to houses. On the ground that stayed in farming, and a great deal of it did, a new crop rose to take the banana's place, and it came in a form the old growers would hardly have known. Not tall green rows open to the sun, but low, dense bushes, ranked in their thousands and hidden away under netting. It was the blueberry, and it would remake the district almost as thoroughly as the banana once had. The turn began as the fruit that had made the town slumped through the late 1990s and the years after. Growers who had spent their lives reading the price of a case of bananas looked for something the steep coast could still grow at a profit, and found it in berries, blueberries above all, and macadamias beside them, crops suited to the warm, wet slopes and worth enough by the kilo to pay for the handwork the ground demanded. What had been a disadvantage for bananas, the closeness, the steepness, the mild, wet air off the sea, was no disadvantage here. The bushes took to the hillsides, and the hillsides which had grown the nation's bananas began to grow the nation's berries instead. And they grew them in a quantity that repeated the old story almost exactly. The Coffs coast and the country around it became the dominant blueberry district in Australia, until something like 85% of the national crop was coming off this one stretch of the New South Wales coast, the same share near enough that the state had once held in bananas, off the same slopes, above the same sea. A district that had been the banana capital of the country quietly became its blueberry capital, and did it on the very ground the bananas had left. The most telling thread of all ran through the people who made the turn. Around Woolgoolga, a little to the north, the Punjabi Sikh families who had come to these hills for the bananas, brought first as wartime labour, then buying farms of their own across the middle of the century, did not leave the land when the old crop failed. They changed what it grew. The same families who had built one of the oldest and largest rural Indian communities in the country on the banana slopes were central again to what replaced it, moving from the old crop to the new without moving off the ground at all. 2 generations had come for one fruit and stayed for another. The continuity was in the soil and in the hands that worked it, more than in anything that grew there. Stand on one of those slopes now, and the change is written across the land in a single image. Where the banana bunches had once hung heavy at head height along the open rows, tied and bagged and cut by hand, there is now a low sea of bushes running close to the ground and over them, drawn taut on posts and wires, the pale stretch of netting, white and grey against the green, thrown across whole hillsides to keep the birds off the fruit. The netting is the new signature of the coast, as the striped green rose had been the old one. Under it the work goes on much as it always had, by hand, on ground too steep for anything else. It is a quieter crop than the one it replaced, and a lower one, and it makes no monument of itself. But it kept the hills in farming when the houses might have taken them all, and it kept the same families on the same ground through the passing of the thing that first brought them there. Where the banana bunches used to hang, the blueberries now ripen under their white netting, close to the earth, on the same steep slopes above the same water. A different fruit, grown by the same hands, on a coast that had found a new way to be what it had always been. Chapter 10. The monument that outlived the crop. Through all of it, the undercutting from the north, the slow slip, the hills sold off for houses, the netting drawn over the berries, one thing did not move. The big banana stayed exactly where it had been raised. The great curve of concrete and steel that had gone up beside the highway in 1964 to announce the banana capital of the country was still there, still bright yellow against the road, long after the thing it announced had gone. By its 50th year, the monument had outlived its meaning. It had been built to boast, to make the traffic stop, and to tell every driver on the coast road that this, above all places, was where the nation's bananas came from. And by the time it turned 50, in 2014, it stood over a district that barely grew the fruit at all. The plantations that had made the name were down to a scattered handful. The steep green hills behind it grew houses and blueberry netting now. The state that had once produced almost all of Australia's bananas grew only a few % of them. The claim built into the whole idea of the thing had quietly stopped being true. The monument itself, meanwhile, had prospered by becoming something else. Somewhere across the decades, the big banana had ceased to be a fruit stall with a landmark bolted to it and become a fun park in its own right. Water slides and a toboggan run, mini golf and an ice rink, all the apparatus of a roadside attraction spread across the slope behind the banana. It went on drawing its millions off the highway exactly as it had been built to do. The cars still turned in. But they turned in now for the slides and the sign and the photograph, not for the fruit. The banana had outlasted the bananas. It had drawn its crowd straight through the disappearance of the very industry it was raised to crown, and most of the people who stopped had no idea there had ever been an industry at all. There is something almost exact in the reversal. A thing built as a boast had become a memorial, and, like a memorial, it now marked the site of something that was gone. The migrant families who had cut the fruit on the hillsides, the hundreds of plantations striped top to bottom with green, the packing sheds and the crates going down to the jetty. The whole working world that had once made a case of bananas, the thing every household on the coast watched, all of it had gone quietly out of the hills, not in a single collapse, but block by block, season by season, sail by sail, until only the monument was left to say it had ever been there. The people who sold up had made rational choices under real pressure. Nobody had failed. The crop had simply been outgrown and outpriced and outbid, and the last thing standing was the giant yellow banana by the road, built to celebrate it. Stand across the highway from it now, near dusk, with the traffic still peeling off the road toward the car park, and the whole of the story is there in a single frame. The big banana burns bright yellow against the grey of the highway, lit and cheerful, the cars still turning in as they have for more than half a century. And behind it, up the steep green fall of the hills where the plantations used to run unbroken to the ridge, two things have taken the fruit's place: the pale sweep of blueberry netting drawn across the slopes, and, above and among it, the tiled rooftops of the houses that climbed the land the bananas let go. A giant concrete banana, raised to crown a capital, standing now over a coast that moved on around it. What a place keeps of its crown, when the thing that made it a capital has gone so quietly from the hills, and whether the monument still means anything at all, or only stands there bright against the road because no one ever had a reason to take it down, is a question the banana does not answer. And the cars, turning in off the highway for the water slides, do not stop to ask.